So welcome to Moving Forward with the Past, Fair Housing and Criminal History. Hello. Oh, there we go. So the purpose of this training is to learn how housing discrimination impacts people with criminal history. We're going to talk about the intersection of criminal history, disparate impact, and the protected class of disability, as well as advocacy strategies for housing applicants when criminal history is a barrier. So on your table, you will find a packet that has all of the slides as well as little note spaces. If you don't have enough at your table, then there should be enough on all of the tables altogether for everyone. So you might have to go steal one off of another table. So you will also see an evaluation that we will ask you to complete at the end of the training. It's really important for us that our funders know how people are receiving these trainings and also that we're doing our jobs and what we say we're doing. And then last but certainly not least, there is going to be a sign-in sheet going around. There's one on this front table right here, and then I think Glenda has one in the back. So go ahead and pass that from table to table and sign in. Again, really important to know who's here and who's receiving this information. Oh, yes. My name is Gina Rizk. I work for the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. I am an education and outreach specialist for the Portland metro area and city of Salem, and I am joined today by my colleague, Mel.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mel Keller. I am the Education and Outreach Coordinator for Marion, Polk, Yamhill, Lynn, Lane, and Benton counties. So I cover a wide swath of the state.
All right. We have a lot of information that we're going to cover today. So in the first few slides, I'm going to go kind of fast. Just as a show of hands, how many of you have ever been to a fair housing training before? Oh my God. Love it. Incredible. So I'm going to kind of speed through these first few slides because they're just a little bit of a general overview. Where's the best place to point the clicker? Oh, there we go. All right, so just a little bit about the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. We are a statewide civil rights organization. We have E&O specialists that are stationed in every region throughout the state, so we are truly statewide. Our goal is to proactively promote housing justice, equity, and inclusion, and we do this through two main avenues. The first is through education and outreach, which Mel and I are a part of, and we do events like this to educate everyone who touches the housing market about their rights and responsibilities under fair housing. And then we also have an enforcement branch, and enforcement kind of works on the reactive side of things. If somebody has a complaint, then they will go to the enforcement team, and the enforcement team will run an investigation and such. So what are fair housing laws? Oh. Okay, so fair housing laws are civil rights laws that promote equal access and enjoyment of housing. It makes it illegal for housing providers to discriminate against certain groups, and we'll talk about what those groups are in just a moment. I do want to point out that it is separate from landlord-tenant law. So landlord-tenant law governs things like how much a deposit you're allowed to charge, or when maintenance needs to be performed and things like that. Fair housing law kind of comes into play when landlord-tenant law is violated because of somebody's protected class. So if any of those landlord-tenant laws are not being followed because of some kind of bias that the housing provider has toward a tenant, then that is where fair housing will come into play. So what is fair housing? The idea is the right of all people to be free from illegal discrimination in the rental, sale, or financing of housing. And in rental housing, these laws cover from the moment you submit your application all the way until the moment that you move off the property. So you even have rights if you have been served an eviction or termination notice. So at any point in the rental process, these laws are in play. So there are 7 federally protected classes. Many of you will already know what they are, so we'll go over them quickly. So the first 4 to be passed in the 68 Fair Housing Act are race, color, religion, and national origin. Later in the 70s, with the women's rights movement, we see sex added as a protected class. Under the current administration, sex also encompasses gender identity and sexual orientation, as well as victims of domestic violence. And then in 88, with the Fair Housing Amendments Act, we see familial status, which is any families living with children under the age of 18, and disability being added as well. And then we're lucky enough to have 3 protected classes here in the state of Oregon. And those protected classes are marital status. So when I think of marital status, I think of a situation that's like if you have a partner that you're not married to when you want to rent a 1-bedroom apartment, a landlord can't say, well, I'm not going to rent you a 1-bedroom apartment because you're not married, right? So marital status should not come up in any kind of housing transaction. We also are lucky enough to have source of income as a protected class. Source of income isn't really about occupation. It's not about wages earned from a job. Source of income is more about rental subsidies and any kind of money that a resident or tenant is receiving either from the government or some other kind of agency in order to help with rent. And then sexual orientation and gender identity. So the reason that's on here twice is because under the current presidential administration, it is a federal protection, but under other presidential administrations, it is not. So it really has to do with how the federal government is interpreting the protected class of sex. So the reason that we have it as a protected class here in Oregon all the time is so that no matter what the federal government is doing, it is always protected here. So there might also be additional protected classes in your locality, so your county, your city. Some of the common ones in the state of Oregon are age over the age of 18, as well as occupation. Occupation is protected in Multnomah County, and age of 18 is pretty common. So I would check within your local jurisdiction to see if age over 18 is also protected. So who complies with fair housing law? The very short answer is literally anyone who has anything to do with the housing market, right? So in terms of the rental process, this can include owners and landlords, property managers, and maintenance staff, as well as contractors who may be coming in to do work on a building. This mostly has to do with things like harassment. In the home buying process, this includes real estate agents, mortgage lenders, and banks, financial institutions, as well as insurers, which we will talk a little bit about when we get to assistance animals. And other people who may be involved are homeowners associations, neighbors. Again, this is kind of an anti-harassment situation. Jurisdictions, so any kind of housing laws that cities or counties are instituting need to follow fair housing laws, as well as advertising media. So how units are advertised is really important. A lot of the times we see senior units that say things like, we're looking for active and healthy seniors to live here. And the reason that that's problematic under fair housing is that it gives kind of this chilling effect to people, seniors who may have a disability, right? They may not feel welcome to live at that property. So the way that units are advertised is also beholden to fair housing laws. So what's considered a dwelling? Well, there are many things. It's kind of easier to say what's not considered a dwelling. So you'll see the technical definition here in the middle, but things that are not considered a dwelling are things like tents. If somebody is like living a nomadic lifestyle where they don't have an address, a permanent address where they receive mail and things like that, so if someone's living in a van, for example, or living in an RV that is not on a fixed plot of land, that would not be considered a legal dwelling. Generally speaking, if a person is staying in a singular location that is meant for habitation for longer than 2 weeks, they're signing some kind of lease agreement or they're exchanging money for living there, so paying rent or something like that, or if they're in a shelter setting where they're doing chores in order to live there, right? This is considered a dwelling. So this could include things like houses, transitional housing, so shelters and things like that, assisted living, any kind of tiny home situation, as well as multifamily housing like apartments and things like that. So, what are the limitations of fair housing? When is it okay for a landlord to deny an applicant or to evict a tenant? So, if an applicant has problem history, right? If they have poor rental references, if they have criminal backgrounds, certain kinds of criminal backgrounds, and we'll obviously be speaking a lot about that today, a poor credit history or an insufficient income in order to pay the rent, then a landlord can rightfully deny an application. And residents who violate their rental agreement in any way, right? So if they're not paying their rent on time, they're disturbing their neighbors, they're inflicting damage on the property, or are involved in illegal activities, then a landlord has the right to issue some kind of notice to that person. So really the bottom line is that somebody needs to be able to follow the stipulations of the rental agreement and meet the criteria on the application, right? Otherwise, then the landlord may be within their rights to either deny an applicant or issue a termination notice. So let's talk a little bit about red flags. I have 3 red flag slides. One is going to be about what that might look like in the application process. The next is going to be during tenancy. And then the last one, we're going to talk about move out. So when somebody is applying to housing, if there is any kind of language that is a refusal to rent, sell, or finance, any no statements, right? So no children, that's an obvious one. If a landlord says to you, I don't accept Section 8 in the state of Oregon, that is also a red flag. So any kind of no statements or refusal to rent can be a red flag, as well as giving out false or inconsistent information. And then the next bullet point, which is linguistic profiling and returning inquiry calls, are kind of the same thing. So if, for example, somebody over the phone inquires about a unit, and the landlord says, oh yeah, it's super available, please come check out our property, whatever, and then they get to the property and the landlord sees that, for example, they're in a wheelchair, and then all of a sudden that unit is not available anymore, right? So this is kind of an example of giving out false or inconsistent information. So the other kind of side of this is linguistic profiling. So we find this out through a process called testing, which is kind of like secret shopping, where we'll have people of different ethnic backgrounds or people with disabilities or other protected classes, members of protected classes, call property managers and see the differences in the information that the property managers are giving them, right? So through that process, we can discover things like linguistic profiling, and we find that people who have an accent or people whose first language is not English or people who don't speak English oftentimes are not getting return calls about inquiries at the same rate as people who speak English as their first language. The next one is steering. So steering is a practice where property managers will try to encourage certain people toward or away from certain geographical areas depending on their protected class. So for example, if there is a family with children who goes to look at a property and the property manager says to them, well, you know, we're really close to a busy street, or we don't have a playground, there's not a lot of other kids that live here in this area, maybe you would be more comfortable renting somewhere else, right? That is a practice called steering, and it is illegal. And this same goes for any other protected class, right? So any kind of statements that have the general vibe of there's not a lot of people like you here, maybe you should live somewhere else, right? It's going to be a red flag for steering. And then lastly is discriminatory advertising. So I talked a little bit about this earlier, but the way that units are advertised, if there is an advertisement saying that a landlord is looking for a specific kind of tenant, right? Then that may be a red flag for fair housing. And really the biggest, most important thing here is consistency. So making sure the property manager or landlord is consistent in how they're applying this rental application criteria, as well as the stipulations of the rental agreement, is really, really important. And I'll say that like a million more times throughout this.
We're going to have question breaks and then we'll run around and yeah.
Thank you for bringing that up. So red flags during tenancy. So I'm gonna flip this slide. Okay, so red flags during tenancy. Any kind of discriminatory statements, right? Using discriminatory or offensive language towards people of certain protected classes is a red flag, as well as inconsistent policies, rules, and procedures. So this is similar to the rental application process. So as an example, FHCO got a call a few years ago from, I think it was the city of Beaverton, where there was a gentleman who had gotten a termination notice for playing his music too loud in the evenings. And on the surface, we were like, well, that's a violation of the rental agreement, right? But what we found when we investigated was that there were many people on that property who were playing their music loud late at night, but they weren't getting termination notices. Only this one person had gotten a termination notice. And we discovered that he was the only person who was playing ranchero music in Spanish. So this became a discrimination case based on national origin, right? So the applications of the rental agreement, of any of the rules of the property, if we're seeing that one person is more like heavily enforcing those or is being more strictly beholden to those rules than other people on the property, that's a red flag for us. The next is discriminating against residents with protected class guests, right? So if somebody brings someone to their property that is their same sex partner, for example, right? And then all of a sudden their landlord is giving them petty notices about things, right? That would be a red flag of discrimination. And then, of course, harassment, intimidation, threats, or coercion. And this one seems like it should be obvious, but that's over 20% of the calls that we get. This includes sexual harassment between neighbors or from the staff of the property to tenants is always a fair housing issue, as well as neighbor on neighbor harassment, as long as it's related to a protected class. So if two residents are living on the same property and one of the tenants is harassing another tenant using racial slurs or something like that, and the landlord does nothing to intervene, that's a fair housing issue. So landlords and property managers have a legal obligation to intervene when they hear of harassment happening and to follow up and to come up with some kind of solution. Failure to do so has legal implications. So red flags during move out. This mostly has to do with retaliation and how people are or why people are serving eviction notices. So if, for example, a tenant files a complaint with the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, and the landlord finds out that that person files a complaint with the Fair Housing Council of Oregon and then gives them an eviction notice, that's retaliation, and it's problematic under fair housing law. And then terminations and eviction notices due to petty reasons or increased inspections because of that person's protected class. So we see this sometimes with source of income, where folks who are using rental subsidies, Section 8, things like that, will have like an increased rate of inspection, right? So the landlord will be like, oh, since you're using Section 8, I want to make sure that, I'm not getting cheated out of my money and that you're not damaging the property. So they'll come in way more often than they do with other tenants and do inspections. If there are notices that are given out due to those increased inspections, that is also a fair housing implication. So when you're thinking about a case and you're thinking whether or not something is may or may not be discrimination, there are two questions to ask yourself. So the first is this person being treated differently than other tenants on the property? If the answer to that question is yes, then you move to the next question, which is it related to protected class? Sometimes it's not related to protected class, right? Sometimes it has to do with someone not paying their rent on time, right? That's not related to protected class and therefore would not be a fair housing issue. But if the answer to both of those questions is yes, then that's possible discrimination and we want to hear about it. It's also important to keep a paper trail, right? So if you have any kind of screenshots, emails from the property managers, pictures of damages to the property, things like that, those are really important to have so that we can do a thorough investigation. And again, in big, bold purple letters, housing providers need to be consistent in how they apply policies, rules, and procedures in all stages of the rental process. Right? Any kind of inconsistent enforcement of rules or rental criteria is going to be something that FHCO is going to want to look into. All right. So Mel is going to take some questions and then we'll move on to housing access and criminal history. So we got a couple of questions. Go ahead.
Okay, so I have an apartment building. The elevator has stopped working.
Wait. I'm going to pause you for 1 second. I forgot to say this at the beginning. Mel and I are not lawyers.
No.
We cannot give legal advice.
This is about steering.
Okay,
So
go ahead.
I have seniors on the upper floors that are struggling to get up and down there. And I have open apartments that are downstairs. Can I suggest reasonable accommodations to them to move because they're seniors struggling? Or does that become steering?
It does not become steering. So especially if you have received any kind of public funding, you have a responsibility to affirmatively further fair housing. And that means that you can suggest things like reasonable accommodations to move them downstairs. So that's totally okay. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So if there is a property and there's domestic violence happening on that property where children are involved and there's been multiple complaints, would that be something for fair housing if the situation doesn't cease?
That's a really good question. I'm going to try not to talk for a super long time about this. So domestic violence is a protected class under the umbrella of the protected class of sex. So, you know, victims of domestic violence are entitled to things like bifurcation of the lease, right? So if they want to move out and, or they want their partner to move out and them to stay, they also are entitled to things like Section 8 portability, early termination of the lease without, you know, paying a termination fee and things like that. However, there can be some limitations if the victim of domestic violence is not seeking assistance, you know, so if that person has not requested any kind of, you know, lock changes, you know, moving the unit, bifurcation of the lease, it gets a little dicey about whether or not the landlord can, you know, suggest those things. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. So kind of to piggyback off of that, what if the domestic violence situation that's happening within that neighborhood has now trickled out to other people and it's involving more of the community because everybody can hear it, everybody sees it on a daily basis, and when complaints are made to management, nothing is happening? Would that be something like going and
yeah, that's something to look into as well. All right, any other questions?
I had the same thing, but it's senior to senior tenancy. So one lives on top, one lives on the bottom, and the one on top is harassing the one at the bottom. And so she's made complaints, requested another unit. There's those percentages, so there's only so much available. Would that be, and she's got mental health issues already, and she's kind of expressed like, it's now a 10. It's no longer a 5, it's a 10. I don't want to hurt somebody, but I'm at the 10. So it's kind of like, where does that fair housing land?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Since I can't like speak to specific scenarios because I'm not a lawyer and I cannot give legal advice, I will speak in kind of hypothetical terms. When there is harassment occurring between two tenants, it is the obligation of the housing provider to intervene. If that housing provider is receiving federal funding, things like mental health issues do count as a disability, and that person can suggest something like a reasonable accommodation to that person and see if they can get them started in the process of, receiving assistance for any issues that they may be having. Yeah. All right. Anything
Any other
else?
questions? Cool.
All right. I will turn it over to Mel.
And we'll have more question breaks like as we go through. So feel free to keep writing down questions. So today we're here. That was kind of our fair housing overview, our refresher. And now we're going to talk about specifically how housing access interacts with criminal history and the criminal justice system. So in the United States, we have a very large prison population. There's an estimated 70 to 100 million people in our country with a criminal record, and that is going to impact their ability to find housing. There are over 10 million children in the United States who have parents who have been in prison. So this isn't something that is just impacting a small population. This is impacting lots of families, lots of communities across the country. And we also know that there are racial disparities in the United States criminal justice system. And this is something that we can see when we look throughout our history all the way up to present day. And so we're going to do a little bit of that right now to just kind of trace that history to show how the how the criminal justice system impacts people differently. So following the passage of the 13th Amendment, which was the amendment to end slavery, Black Americans were specifically targeted by policing and sentencing to maintain systems of segregation and white supremacy. So even though the 13th Amendment bans involuntary servitude, there's an exception in the 13th Amendment for accepting cases of incarceration. So basically people who are incarcerated are still able to be forced to work without pay. Some states have gotten rid of that, taken it out of their constitution, state constitutions, but it's still in the federal constitution. Throughout history, there have been a lot of things such as black codes, vagrancy laws, and convict leasing, which maintained these systems of oppression following the Civil War. So even though slavery itself was illegal, there were systems in place that maintained these power hierarchies that impacted Black Americans in particular more harshly. Once we get into the 20th century, the war on drugs and other policies such as broken windows model and three strikes laws contributed to the over-policing of Black communities. The broken windows model is this idea that if you address the small crimes, you will prevent the larger crimes. We know this isn't true, and what it was used was to over-police, in particular, communities of color, and to target people for crimes that other people, particularly white people, were not being punished for. Similarly, the war on drugs, we know about the disparities between crack and cocaine sentencing laws. In order to receive the same amount of jail time for possession of cocaine, you needed to possess like 100 times more cocaine than crack. Crack was used disproportionately by Black communities. Cocaine was used disproportionately by white communities. So we know that policies like these have existed throughout our country's history and have contributed to kind of this institutional structure that impacts Black communities and communities of color more than white communities. In Oregon in particular, we can see this as well. So this is a map or a chart by the Prison Policy Institute that shows the number of people incarcerated per 100,000 people in by racial group. And so the first column is white, the second column is Hispanic, the really big column is Black, and the last column is American Indian, Alaska Native. So for every 100,000 people in the state of Oregon, 506 white people are incarcerated. For every 100,000 people in Oregon, 3,195 Black people are incarcerated. And you might know that here in Oregon, we have a very low population of people of color, and yet they are highly disproportionately represented in our criminal justice system. And that is also shown here in this graph. The top line, this is basically how much of the population each racial group is versus how much of the prison population they are. So in the biggest line at the top is the white population. So 78% of the population in Oregon is white. They account for 69% of the prison population. These three down at the bottom, the largest increase is the blue line, which is Black folks. 2% of the population of Oregon, 10% of the prison population. So there's an 8% overrepresentation of Black folks in our prisons compared to a decrease in representation of white folks. And being incarcerated costs a lot of money. It costs a lot of money to the state, to us as taxpayers, but also to the individuals, which can contribute to difficulties following incarceration and following an engagement with the criminal justice system that can impact people beyond just the time that they were incarcerated. So in Oregon, jails charge up to $3.15 for a 15-minute phone call. Prisons charge $1.05 for the same phone call. Prisons can charge up to a 30% fee to transfer money to an incarcerated loved one. People in prisons must pay for hygiene items and other basics regardless of their ability to pay. Someone who is considered indigent, so unable to pay, can get support with certain supplies, but then they have to pay it back once they are out of incarceration. And even though slavery is illegal, people in Oregon prisons are paid as little as 5 cents an hour for their work. And a lot of industries in Oregon and across the country use prison labor to make things. Oregon also charges up to 25 cents for an email that you send to and from prison. And if you're making 5 cents an hour, these costs can add up very quickly. Yeah. And this is all information from the Prison Policy Institute. They have information like this for every state. Highly recommend looking at it. It's nuts. So that's kind of a broad history of, we got some problems in our system. How does that impact housing? Because that's what we're here to talk about. So there's a kind of project called the National Inventory of Collateral Consequences of Convictions. So this is a project that looks at when somebody has been convicted of a crime, what else are they impacted by? How else does their life change because of that one conviction? And they found more than 1,300 criminal record related barriers to housing and residency access across state, county, and city jurisdictions, and 26 barriers at the federal level. These are things like not being able to access certain types of federal benefits, things like TANF or SNAP benefits. This includes policies that are existing at the state level, at the city, at the jurisdictional level that prevent folks with criminal convictions from getting housing. It might include things like no crime ordinances, which are illegal, but a lot of cities still have them that basically say that if you have been convicted of a crime, you can't live in these certain areas. We also know that things like background checks disproportionately impact folks with criminal histories, and we'll talk a bit about that later. Housing forfeiture and evictions, things that are happening while people are incarcerated. If maybe somebody is incarcerated and they were the main breadwinner for their family might face an eviction due to being unable to pay. This also happens if somebody is receiving public assistance and a family member wants to come live with them and that family member has been incarcerated. It can impact their ability to maintain public assistance. Access to public housing and other benefits. The 2018 Prison Policy Initiative study found that formerly incarcerated people are 10 times more likely to experience homelessness. So this is something that we see that the criminal justice system disproportionately targets Black and Hispanic communities. People with convictions are 10 times more likely to experience homelessness. Therefore, it's a racial justice issue. That's kind of the logic that we're creating here. And that's what we're going to talk a lot about today. We're going to talk about both kind of some things around disability and the protected class of disability, and then also disparate impact, which is where somebody is treated differently when a policy looks neutral on its face, but has a disproportionate impact on certain communities. Background check companies, we will talk about them in a bit. There's some fun new stuff going through the courts about background check companies. So that's just a little teaser. So Gina talked about some red flags earlier about what to look out for housing discrimination. These are some specifically about criminal history. So saying statements like no criminal histories, no arrests, an arrest does not equal a conviction, or no felony convictions, just broadly. Statements like that are not suggested. And a lot of this comes from the 2016 HUD, Housing and Urban Development Guidance on Criminal History. So in 2016, Housing and Urban Development put out this guidance saying you can't say no arrests anymore. That is no longer okay because we know who is disproportionately affected by those. And so this kind of comes from them. They have a great little primer on it that we also have on our website. Refusing to provide a copy of background check results that are used to disqualify an applicant. So if somebody is disqualified based on background check, they have a right to know why and a right to see those results to show that it was something that, you know, did disqualify them. Refusal to conduct an individualized assessment or accept supplemental documentation. And we'll talk a bit about this later, but basically this is the way to respond to people who have convictions, felony or otherwise, on their record, is that you do an individualized assessment. So how long ago did the crime take place? Did it take place 20 years ago and it was a one-time thing? Or, you know, is it more recent, but they've been through rehabilitation efforts and are working with a case manager or something like that? Maybe they have a letter from their parole officer saying, you know, this client has been doing a great job and they would be a great tenant and I will vouch for them. Refusal to accept a reasonable accommodation based on the severity of the conviction. So we'll get into, Gina will talk in a bit about the connection between disability and criminal history. Not all criminal history is related to disability, but sometimes it is. And so then the kind of general reasonable accommodation process will also apply. And when we're talking about individualized assessments for criminal history, think about it in terms of reasonable accommodation request. So you look at each reasonable accommodation request on its own and you say, okay, I'm gonna go through, look at all of the information, the verification, make a decision. That's how you should treat criminal convictions with any supplemental information as well. The difference is just in terms of kind of the legal requirements. So you're required to, you know, look at reasonable accommodations. It's best practice to do individualized assessments. Similarly, like Gina said, consistency is key. So if you are changing how the application process works, when you find out somebody has a criminal conviction, that could be a red flag. If you are suddenly asking more questions or requiring a stricter background check when you find out that somebody has a conviction, that could be a red flag. Okay, and now we'll do questions. Gina, do you want to run? Got one back there.
Thank you so much for that information. I wanted to point out my college professor had done a study similar to what you showed for the stats. And those stats remain true for the exact same crime. So even if it's the exact same crime, that those stats of white people being less likely to go to jail and be incarcerated, and then also the length of time as well. I actually am, my colleague sent me to this class. She's opening up a building that is, we're partnering with a group that helps house formerly incarcerated people. And we're struggling to convince the management company we've hired to adjust the screening criteria for the criminal background check. So I'm curious if you have any stats or examples of properties, and maybe you can send them to me offline, of properties that have been successful by removing criminal background checks.
Oh my gosh, I would love to chat with you after this. The one group that I will just kind of broadly mention is Sponsors in Eugene. They have a few properties and they're currently in the process of a study that's being done by the University of Oregon to kind of look at when you are housing formerly incarcerated people, how much does it help them? How much does having stable housing benefit people after incarceration, thereby benefiting the community, because these people are way less likely to be repeat offenders and to go back into the system, which saves all of us taxpayer dollars, as well as being like the right thing to do. So yes, connect with me offline and also look up sponsors in Eugene. Any other questions?
Are there any folks that you guys are working with that are providing services for culturally specific communities regarding mental health services? Because I think, in my opinion, part of that is providing that for them to not become offenders and whatnot.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. Gina, do you know about anybody in Portland who does that?
I not necessarily with mental health services, but I know that Central City Concern within the city of Portland has a program called Change the Narrative, where they're specifically assisting with Black men who are reentering from incarceration, and they may have some resources on that. And that organization is called what did I literally just say? Central City Concern. Yes.
And I will also say that I've done some work with cities of Corvallis and Albany, both of whom are kind of looking at this issue, particularly when they look at their housing production strategy and dealing with the unhoused populations, because people of color are overrepresented in unhoused populations in these cities where they are the very, very small minority of people in those cities. And so I can put you in contact. I forget the name of the group in Corvallis that I'm thinking of, but they might be able to connect with you as well.
Okay, we probably have time for one more. So.
Cascadia Health. Ooh, Cascadia Health.
Cascadia Health. Oh, Cascadia Health.
Their
Yeah.
primary was mental health, and they now do housing with a focus on mental health. Ooh, Cascadia Health. Incredible. See, this is why we come to this conference. So we all learn things. Okay, we have one back there and then one up here.
Okay.
So fair housing laws prevent race from being factored into an application decision for good reason, but the unintended consequences of that are extremely inequitable. So how do we reconcile not factoring race when we know that Black and brown people are way more likely to be targeted for crimes, to be incarcerated? How do we not factor in race
when like dealing with the issues?
Yes.
That is such a good question. And the answer is it sucks. The Fair Housing Act is an equality-based piece of legislation, not an equity-based piece of legislation, meaning that everybody is treated the same, or that's the goal under the Fair Housing Act, rather than correcting for historical wrongs and like institutionalized discrimination. There are some attempts at this. Gina's going to talk about the FAIR ordinance here in Portland later on. Some cities have introduced preference policies, things like that. We recommend that folks who are looking to do preference policies work with a lawyer who has done kind of statistical analysis, because there's a way for you to introduce a preference policy that says, you know, we know that these people are disproportionately impacted by the housing crisis, by homelessness, and therefore we are going to structure our system to respond to that. If cities are introducing preference policies without that kind of statistical background, unfortunately, they can like fall upon the fair housing law, which sucks because they're doing the thing that is trying to fix the problem. And yet, because the law isn't structured that way, it becomes hard to deal with. Okay, we're gonna come up here and then we're gonna go back there. Sorry to make you run around, Gina.
Just mentioning a program that does help people with criminal backgrounds is Central City Concern HRR program, the Housing Rapid Response. It's not as rapid as it sounds, but it is. It's a process. So that is a good tool to use, that and the mentor program.
Amazing. Okay, Gina's gonna go back to the far back.
Where was it again?
Yes, back there.
Thank you.
And yeah, if any of you like work with programs like that, feel free to drop your information up here afterwards. We'd love to put together like a big list of all of them.
Not to keep highlighting CCC, but to keep highlighting CCC. Yeah, we also, going back to the preferences within our supportive housing, a lot of our properties have preferences for referral partner programs. So like Flip the Script, which I think you might have been what you were talking about, or Karibu and Imani Center are all African-American serving programs that are able to refer into a lot of our new buildings that are coming online. Essentially having a preference for Native African Americans as well as Native Americans through NARA and things like that, providing services for people that are formerly incarcerated, dealing with severe and persistent mental illness or substance use disorders. So
amazing. Central City, love them.
Love them.
Any last questions before we get into criminal history? Yes. Last one. Getting your steps in, Gina.
I love this for me.
Okay, so this one's from the chat on Zoom. They're asking, what about people who have felonies but were not incarcerated? I have a friend who received many felonies for receiving a targeted arrest and was blamed for a lot of vandalization during the BLM protests. They now face hardship to assess housing and work because of their advocacy work. And by being in the wrong place at the wrong time, they were not incarcerated and they're a person of color.
That's a great question. Once again, the kind of answer is individualized assessment. So they should be they should be able to provide letters of explanation in a hypothetical situation similar to the one you're describing. The property managers should not be turning people away if they have a felony outright. That is not allowed. There are specific instances that I think we're going to talk about in a bit, where certain felony convictions can be outright denied, and those really refer to things that are going to be a danger to the property or the residents. So very, very specific instances rather than something so broad. If you are facing kind of issues like that, if you are finding applications or getting turned away immediately for having a felony on your record, feel free to give us a call. We'd love to chat with you. Last thing.
With that said, there's grassroots efforts to go ahead and do the expungement program through Clackamas. We're in Lincoln County, so we drive folks over there because they do it every other weekend, and they have grants to pay for the fingerprinting, which is like a $35 charge. So as long as their debt is paid, if it's not, then we can help them guide them through that payment program, and then they have a date when they can apply. And it's ongoing grassroots, as well as Lynn Benton Community College. That's another place that does expungement. So we go through that inventory. If they have that, then we try to get that out of the way in the process. And so they can get a letter for housing saying they're in the process. It is expungible. It's going to go away. It's just a 3-month process.
Yes, expungement is possible. There are lots of efforts around the state that are doing that.
Yeah, I want to point out the PCC Clear Clinic is such a wonderful resource for people in the Portland metro area looking to expunge either criminal convictions or evictions from their records. So that's something to be thinking about. Okay, so let's talk about the intersection of the protected class of disability and criminal history. So something that I want to highlight is that criminal history in and of itself is not a protected class, right? But it has a lot of intersections with protected class. We talked a little bit about race. Now we're going to talk about disability. So about 50% of the contacts that the Fair Housing Council of Oregon gets every year are related to reasonable accommodation and disabilities. About 15 to 20% are related to race, color, and national origin. And then 30% is everything else combined, right? So a huge chunk of what we interact with every year is about reasonable accommodation and disability. So the definition of disability under fair housing is purposefully very broad, okay? So the definition is any physical or mental condition that substantially impairs a major life activity, which includes but is not limited to walking, seeing, hearing, breathing, thinking, or caring for oneself, right? So this may be different than the definition that you have heard according to ADA or Social Security or any other kinds of sets of laws that address disability. This is specifically for fair housing, and it is a very broad definition, and it is that way on purpose. Okay, so disability also includes ongoing chronic medical conditions, things like MS, cerebral palsy, schizophrenia, autism, seizure disorders, asthma, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, ADHD, things like that. So the one thing that I do want to point out here is that mental health issues are legally considered a disability, as is substance use disorder. Okay, and we'll touch on that in a second. So disability also protects individuals with a history of alcohol and drug addiction, but not current users of illegal drugs. So if somebody has a criminal conviction on their record that is related to substance use, and we'll talk about what that might look like, then they can request a reasonable accommodation in their application to have that overlooked, okay? This also includes individuals with a history of a disability. So if somebody was like in a car accident 4 or 5 years ago, and as a result of that car accident, they weren't able to work and their credit score dropped, okay? If they can cite the disability as the reason for that credit score dropping and having financial troubles, then they can also ask for a reasonable accommodation in their application to have that overlooked. And same with individuals who are assumed to have a disability, whether or not they actually do. So really quickly, the reason that this was put into place was during the AIDS epidemic. So people who were very thin or people who may had something about them that would suggest that they were gay would go into leasing offices, and landlords would assume that they had HIV or AIDS. And so they would not rent to them. So individuals who are assumed to have a disability are also protected. Okay, so reasonable accommodation and modification requests are sometimes needed to restore equal access or enjoyment of housing for somebody living with a disability. So a landlord might need to add something, remove a barrier, or make an exception to a policy, rule, or procedure. So the difference between accommodation and modification. Modification is a physical change to a unit, right? You need a ramp to the front door. You need grab bars in the shower, something like that, right? Accommodation has to do with policy, right? An exception to the rental criteria is an example of an accommodation. So that's what I just said. Oops. Okay. So an exception to a policy, rule, or procedure. This could look like asking for an assistance animal on a no pet property. And assistance animals are not considered pets, so they cannot be barred from living anywhere. Or something like a reserved parking space close to one's unit, even if there is no reserved parking generally on the property. So how do they work? They can occur at any time. So this is during the application process while somebody is already living there, as well as after they have received a termination notice. There is no limit to the number of requests that somebody can make. So if you hear a landlord say, I've already granted you a reasonable accommodation request, I'm not going to give you another one, that's a red flag. Okay. Each request is evaluated on its own merit. So that's kind of the idea of individualized assessment that Mel was talking about earlier, right? So again, this also is related to like if somebody's already asked for multiple reasonable accommodation requests, they can't be denied because they've already requested one, right? It is generally initiated, the process is initiated by the person with a disability. However, if a landlord receives public funding, they may have an obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. And in that case, then they can suggest reasonable accommodation requests without the tenant asking for them. And residents must be able to meet the terms of the rental and lease agreement, right? So really the purpose of reasonable accommodation and modification requests are about access, right? But they still need to be able to meet the terms of the rental agreement. Okay, so what kind of verification do you need to provide for reasonable accommodation? So there's a couple elements to this. When somebody has a reasonable accommodation request, let's say, for example, this person had a charge on their record related to possession of a controlled substance, right? You must be able to demonstrate that there is a connection between the reasonable accommodation and the disability. So the barrier here is that this conviction may result in them being rejected when they apply, right? So their reasonable accommodation request might be, I want you to overlook this. When you see my application, you're going to see this charge on my record. I would like for you to overlook it. So that's the connection between the barrier and the disability. We know that possession charges are often related to substance use disorder, okay? So you need verification of that. So that can be a letter from a qualified individual. It does not have to be a medical professional, but it can be. So things like a case manager or a sponsor, or a certificate of graduation from a drug and alcohol program can serve as verification that this charge is related to disability and that they have the disability, right? The verification can be delivered by the tenant, the applicant, or the provider, and can be delivered through mail, email, or fax. We actually have fillable forms on our website to help write reasonable accommodation requests. So if you go to the link up here, there are a lot of great resources up there. So verifiers of a disability have to be a qualified individual. And that means that they know the person's situation and the details of their disability, but it doesn't have to be a qualified professional. Okay, so questionable verifiers might be like a friend or like the grocery store teller, right? Generally speaking, those cannot be verifiers of a disability. But any kind of caseworker that is familiar with that person's disability, if that person sees a religious figure for counseling regularly, then that person can also serve as a verifier. Okay, so it doesn't just have to be a qualified professional or healthcare professional, although it certainly can be. They must state that the reasonable accommodation is necessary for equal access or enjoyment of the unit. That language is really important to use in those letters. And it must establish a connection between the accommodation request and the disability. However, this is very important. Verifiers do not need to disclose the type of disability or the physical benefits of the accommodation. Okay, so if a landlord is pressing you for a diagnosis, is pressing you for details about the severity of the disability, that is a red flag. All you have to do is state that that person has a disability under the definition of the Fair Housing Act and that they need a reasonable accommodation. That's it. Okay, so we know that there are some convictions that are often related to disability. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, but it's some examples of what that might look like. So if somebody has a history of substance use disorder, that might look like charges related to public intoxication, assault, public indecency, resisting arrest, theft or burglary, possession, forgery or identity theft. If somebody has a mental health disability, it could look like disorderly conduct, offensive littering, trespass, theft, possession in terms of self-medicating, and stalking. And if somebody has a developmental disability, it is possible for them to be an unwitting accomplice in a crime due to vulnerability. That is definitely something that happens, unfortunately. And so if somebody is an unwitting accomplice in a crime, it may be worthwhile to look into whether or not they have a disability. So again, when you are submitting that reasonable accommodation request, it is important to verify what has kind of shifted in that person's life since the conviction occurred. Why is it no longer going to be a problem when they're living on the property, right? It's important to provide verification, and the applicant still needs to be able to meet the requirements of the rental agreement, right? They still need to be able to pay their rent on time and be a good neighbor to those around them, right? All right, I'm going to hand it over to Mel really quickly.
Yes, and we are not going to do questions right now, unfortunately. We're going to just speed through it, and then at the end, we'll take questions. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about today is this concept of disparate impact and how it impacts criminal history. So the definition of disparate impact is when a neutral sounding rule, policy, or procedure is applied and disproportionately and negatively impacts a protected class of people. So some examples, and these are all real examples that we've seen. No toys on the balcony disproportionately impacts people with children. No one can cook with curry in the complex. That was a case out of Hillsborough, if I remember correctly. No one can work in a fish cannery. This was a case out of Newport, I believe, where people who work in the fish canneries wear coveralls, and then oftentimes because it's stinky, they will take their coveralls off outside of their home to not bring it inside. And there were landlords who had rules that you can't work in a fish cannery and live here because it's stinky. However, we went and looked into this and found that the majority of people who worked in the fish canneries are of Hispanic or Latino origin. So it became a question of discrimination based on national origin. So even though on the face of it, it seems like it would impact everybody equally, in practice, it has a disproportionate impact on certain communities. So that's kind of how you can think about disparate impact. So when we're looking at criminal history, we've mentioned this before, people who are Black and brown have a disproportionate interaction with the criminal justice system compared to white folks. So saying something like no arrests on an application is going to have a disparate impact on communities of color when put into practice. For felony convictions, landlords need to identify the specific convictions which would endanger residents or property. This might be the production and distribution of methamphetamines or other controlled substances. It might be sex offense convictions. It might be arson, but there are very specific instances where you can just deny outright. Other than that, it has to be this individualized assessment. Housing providers should also consider how long ago a interaction with the criminal justice system took place. We know from research that somebody who committed a crime 7 years ago is no more likely to reoffend than somebody who has never committed a crime. So there is kind of statistical evidence that supports the fact that people are not going to reoffend when they have systems in place to support them, like housing, food, jobs, things like that. And then also all rehabilitation efforts should be considered. Going through a DNA program, drug and alcohol program, going through a rent well or ready to rent class, things like that are indicators that somebody is ready and interested and willing to follow the rental agreement, and that their past should not be a deciding factor in whether they get to rent or not. Yes.
This also includes sex offender treatment. We get questions about this all the time. What about people with sex offenses? Can we write a reasonable accommodation request for them? Can we advocate for them? The answer to that question is yes. Unless that person is required to register as a sex offender or has certain stipulations about the areas they live in, right? So if they're not allowed to live within a certain boundary of a school or something like that, then that may be an exception. If they're required to register, that may be an exception. But with other kinds of sex offenses, if the person has completed sex offender treatment, that is a really good way to advocate. Getting those details are a really good way to advocate for that person getting into housing.
Yes. So in a screening application, landlords will screen for rental history, past references, evictions, financial history, income and credit, and criminal history. And just a quick note on credit. We know, many of us, some of us know that credit is another institution in this country that can have disparate impact on Black and brown communities. People who are poor, people who have had interactions with the justice system, people who don't have wealthy parents who were able to set up a debit card for them when they were 16, can all have poor credit, less due to their own ability to repay debts and pay back their credit cards, and due to these institutional structures. So we know that credit has a disparate impact on communities of color. Unfortunately, there are some court cases that are going through the courts right now that are looking at this, and there are some national organizations that are doing great work around credit and disparate impact. It's not the law yet. So just as a kind of fun preview of what's to come in many years down the line. And then criminal history as well. Housing application packets, having proof of income, having a letter of explanation or reasonable accommodation request, having letters of reference, and some letters of reference could be from past landlords, employers, volunteer supervisors, case managers, religious leaders, sponsors, therapists, counselors, etc. These are all people who can help advocate for a client. And if you are one of these people, feel free to reach out to us. We can help you write those letters. We can give you examples of letters that have been written that have helped people get into housing with barriers on their record. So these are some of the other examples. You have this information in your packet as well. When considering a letter of reference, landlords can consider how long you've known that person. You know, have you only known them for 2 months, but you've been working with them weekly on these issues? That might be something. Or if you've known this person for 6 years, you've met with them monthly every month for the past 6 years. Rehabilitation programs, like Gina mentioned, sex offense rehabilitation programs, other groups or workshops. So kind of going regularly to NA or AA meetings, things like that. Other documents that demonstrate stability. So stability is kind of the key that housing providers are looking for when they're looking at applications. They want somebody who is going to have the income to pay their rent on time, who's going to stay in the property and not, you know, be rude to other neighbors. And so things like having employment verification, rehab or treatment program logs that show completion of programs, goals or plans that are showing progress. You know, these are my goals for the next 6 months, and these are the steps that I will take to achieve them. If you're getting any of this information in consultation with a therapist, a counselor, a medical provider, having a release of information is also important so that that individual can share that information with the landlord. If there's no release of information, the medical provider is going to be constrained by HIPAA laws about privacy. So just to kind of make the difference clearer, the reasonable accommodation is related to the disability. It is something that housing providers are legally required to accept and address, aside from specific circumstances. The letter of explanation is if you have something that's a criminal history that's not related to a disability, and yet you still are able to show the barrier, show, you know, these are the things that have changed. It wasn't related to a disability, but since that conviction took place, I have been in therapy. I have been working with a case manager. I have done ready to rent classes. And here's a letter from my case manager talking about my progress. So it's a similar type of letter. It's just going to be different in terms of the enforcement mechanism that the Fair Housing Act has to require the looking at them. So this is an example of a reasonable accommodation letter. Once again, we have this on our website along with other, we have like verifier letters. So you can send a letter to your doctor and say, can you just fill in this information? So when you run my rental application, you will see a criminal conviction from 10 years ago. This barrier is directly related to my disability. Since then, I have had no additional convictions or interactions with the criminal justice system. As defined by the Fair Housing Act, I am a person living with a disability. I would ask for reasonable accommodation to have this conviction overlooked when you run my background check. Notice how you don't need to say what the disability is. You just have to have the letter of reasonable accommodation and say that the barrier is connected to a disability. Doesn't matter if it was substance use disorder, mental health, anything. It just matters that it is a disability. And then including the documentation. Comparatively, an explanation letter might look like this. So it's going to be less formal. There's less language requirements. You don't have to say that, you know, a reasonable accommodation is needed to live, to have equal access and enjoyment to housing. Instead, it will be these are the barriers that I have on my application, and these are the things that I have done to address them. So, and here are the people you can contact to talk about that. So that kind of same information, but less of a legal constriction, I would say. This is also a potential script if you are working with clients, if you're a case manager, going through scenarios, how to talk about criminal history, how to talk about convictions with a landlord and a housing provider, to provide that information upfront and to be very upfront about it, to show that, this is on my record, but it's not going to impact my ability to be a good tenant. And now Gina's going to talk about the fair ordinance.
Okay, I'm gonna do this so fast. I've
Super fast. We have
never
like
talked
4
in my
minutes.
whole entire life. Okay, so the fair ordinance is a landlord tenant law ordinance that was enacted in the city of Portland. So this is only applicable in the city of Portland. However, there are other jurisdictions that are looking at adopting something similar. I would highly recommend going onto the website, the landlord tenant law website for the state of Oregon, and looking at the restrictions of the fair ordinance. So they suggest these low barrier screening criteria, right? So applications cannot be rejected for non-convictions, right? But that's kind of a general thing, right? So arrests, arraignments, things like that, right? Non-convictions, diversions or deferrals, dismissals and expungements, crimes that are no longer illegal. So if you have a client who, for example, has marijuana possession charges from 10 years ago, right, then this could be applicable to you. Juvenile crimes, so any crimes that are committed under the age of 18, misdemeanors that are greater than 3 years old, and felonies that are greater than 7 years old. Again, the asterisk there is the exception of things like arson, or when somebody is required to register as a sex offender. And insufficient rental history. This can be really big for things like college students, but also for people who have been incarcerated for a long period of time, right? So somebody has been incarcerated for 7 years and has no rental history in the last 7 years. They cannot be denied in the city of Portland for that if that housing provider is using this low barrier screening criteria. Do you have the, okay. So if the landlord does not use the low barrier screening criteria, then they must conduct an individualized assessment for information, any information found on a background check that would result in denial. This includes credit history. This includes rental history and criminal history. So anything that the landlord finds on your background check that may be result in denial, they must consider supplemental documentation for in the city of Portland. So I just thought it was really important to bring that up. Okay,
great. And Gina covers Portland, so she knows that stuff. I don't. We don't have it in Eugene yet. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about is screening criteria, because under the 2016 HUD guidance, screening companies have to follow the Fair Housing Act. So if you use a private background check company to run background checks for your property, that company has to follow the Fair Housing Act. And sometimes they don't know this. And so it's great if you hear about instances of screening companies that aren't doing their due diligence, because we would like to hear about that. There was a court case in 2019, the Connecticut Fair Housing Council versus CoreLogic MTD. Their background check process basically, since it is making rental decisions for the landlord, since the background check is saying, you should not rent to this applicant because of these barriers, because that is a rental decision, the background check company has to follow the Fair Housing Act, meaning these same things around individualized assessments, around not saying no arrests, have to be followed by the screening companies as well. There's currently a case going through, it's in the Massachusetts District Court right now, against Safe Rent, where a group of Black plaintiffs are arguing that Safe Rent's screening criteria result in an unlawful disparate impact against Black and Hispanic rental applicants because the underlying algorithm relies on certain factors that disproportionately disadvantage Black and Hispanic applicants, such as credit history and non-tenancy related debt. So that court case is still in process. The Justice Department put out a statement of interest saying, you know, we agree with the plaintiffs, they're doing the wrong thing. And now it's going through the courts. Highly suggest reading up on it. It's really interesting. And this is one of those instances where we're seeing more about disparate impact coming up as it relates to credit history. So best practice to proceed with caution before employing new algorithm-based tenant screening tools to streamline the review process. And housing providers may be liable for inadvertently employing algorithms that have a discriminatory impact. So keep that in mind. If you see something happening, tell us. We will go and yell at the screening companies for you. Applicants have a right to know why they are denied, if they are denied. I'm going to go through this very quickly. And you can contact us for reporting housing discrimination, for learning about fair housing rights, for getting information for your residents or tenants, for help writing letters of reasonable accommodation, or help with supporting documents. We do a lot of stuff that's not just investigating information about discrimination that we would love to share with all of you. And yeah, that's going to be, I'm going to just go through this. If you want to be a fair housing tester and do secret shopping, come and talk to us. It's very interesting and fun. And finally, there's evaluations on your table. Please fill them out. This is our contact information. You can also come up and get cards from us if you'd like. Thank you so much. Sorry this was so fast. We have a lot to talk about, and you're all wonderful.